This week on No Border, No Country, illegal migrants suing for taxpayer cash, Karine Jean-Pierre, White House press secretary, don't talk about immigration, you'll tip off the smugglers, and the Border Patrol seizes 1 million fentanyl pills near the Mexico-U.S. border.
Welcome to No Border, No Country, the podcast of the Immigration Reform Law Institute. My name is Brian Lonergan. I'm joined by Judge Matt O'Brien. Matt, how are you doing?
Very good, Brian. How are you today?
Outstanding. So let's jump right in. We had a couple court cases that Early was involved in that raised some very fundamental questions about where we are with immigration policy, where we are as a nation. The first one happened in Arizona, and you can view this on the Early website at irli.org. The headline is Illegals. I don't want to say that word on the show. We're going to say immigration violators, okay? You can kind of read between the lines and see what that means. Go to the website, you'll see what it means, but we're not going to say that term on the show. We're good with that, right?
Unlawfully present migrants.
Unlawfully present migrants go for taxpayers' money. So in a nutshell, families of immigration violators are suing the federal government in Arizona, federal district court, over their treatment after they crossed the border illegally. What's this about, Matt?
Well, these families who all entered the United States without authorization are claiming that after they reported themselves to Border Patrol and said they wanted to stay here, that they were improperly separated from their children when they were placed in detention. And they're claiming this violated their constitutional rights, therefore they're entitled to monetary damages. But the whole claim is rather ridiculous because these are people who had no right to be in the U.S. And the fact is that anyone who's arrested in the United States, if they have children with them, is separated from the children.
So how does this differ from a U.S. citizen being encountered by law enforcement? Like the example we've heard before, if someone was arrested or apprehended for passing a bad check in a store and they had their young child with them, they're not going to say, well, you're going to the lockup and your child's coming with you. Arrangements are made for that child to be placed elsewhere. Isn't this sort of an extra benefit that these immigration violators are demanding or expecting in this case?
Yeah, they're asking for something that U.S. citizens are clearly not entitled to. The fact is you're 100% correct. If you're arrested with a child, that child is going to be separated from you. And these are individuals who were arrested because they're essentially trespassers in the United States. And the United States government has a right to determine whether it's going to evict them or not. And because of that, they separate the children from the parents, specifically to ensure the safety of the children. They also separate the detainees by sex. So male and female children are detained separately. Males and females are detained separately. And as a matter of fact, if you're in a family detention center, typically people are separated as well. There are dormitories where the adults and children are separated, and then the men and women are separated.
Now, people that would consider themselves border hawks, who want very hardline position, would say, well, if you're here illegally, you have no rights. You should the Constitution should not apply to you in any way whatsoever. But the way our law operates, that's not the case, right?
No, it's not. The Constitution applies to anybody who is present in the United States, but it applies in different ways. So people who are here are entitled to due process. They're entitled to a fair trial if they're accused of a crime. They're entitled to not be deprived of their life or property without an appropriate process. It's a little bit different with people who have entered the country without authorization, though, because they don't have a liberty interest like U.S. citizens do. U.S. citizens have a right to be free from government detention until they've been tried and convicted for a crime, or if they've been arrested pursuant to a crime and are held pending a trial. People who are unlawfully present in the United States who are not U.S. citizens don't have a liberty interest. If you don't have permission to be here, you don't have permission to be free and roaming about the country. So it's a different situation than it is with U.S. citizens. And I'm a little shocked that the court was willing to countenance this claim. There's been ample precedent on it saying that there is no right to be free from detention as an unlawfully present migrant.
Now, help me understand this too, because I think the average person might hear these stories and think, when someone passes a bad check, for the example we used, and they go to jail or prison, there's an element of punishment in that, right? But it's not the same if you're being detained on immigration charges, right?
No, it's not remotely the same thing. It's an entirely different situation. This goes back to a couple of cases that were decided in the 1880s, 1890s called Ecu v. United States and Feng Yu Ting v. United States. And the Supreme Court said in both of those cases that deportation, removal from the United States, is not punishment. It's simply the process of removing someone who does not have the authorization of the government to be here back to the place where he or she has full citizenship rights. So it's like an eviction from an apartment that you don't have a right to be in.
Yeah. Now, the other thing is that some of the plaintiffs in these cases may argue, well, I'm here and this is the case, and what are you going to do with me? Or I'm being held unlawfully. But isn't it true that when they are being detained, that door is not locked necessarily? I mean, they have the right or the option to return to their home country, correct?
Yeah, there's a case that goes back to the 1500s. Immigration is a civil matter. So you're in civil detention. And I don't know if it was Blackstone in his commentaries on the laws of England or one of the other famous British legal scholars, but he said the difference between civil and criminal detention is that the civil detainee has the jail key in his pocket. And what that means is that if you're being detained for a civil offense, there is usually something that the court has said you can do to get out, which is pay the fee, return the property that you borrowed, never returned, or in the case of people in immigration detention, sign the papers and agree to go home where you have a right to be. So you're 100% correct about that.
Now, the other case that we're looking at is in New York City. There's a issue regarding voting rights for non-citizens. I'll clean that up for YouTube as well. But if you go to the early website on January 5th date, there's a release with all the details on this. Matt, what's going on with this case?
Well, the folks in the Big Apple have decided that so they can engage in politically correct virtue signaling, that everyone should be able to vote whether they have permission to be here or not. And I just want you to stop and think about this for a moment. Can you just see if we all uprooted, relocated to France and said, we believe we're entitled to vote in the next election? I mean, the reaction would be, oh, you crazy Americans! Why do you think this is correct? And so I just wonder, why is it, voting in the English-speaking world is something that has traditionally been associated with citizenship. And it's a civic duty as part of a democratic system. And so I'm not sure what's wrong with the knuckleheads in charge of New York, that they think it'd be a brilliant idea to give all of the uninvited guests a right to vote. And they're doing this at the same time that they're complaining about the number of people from foreign countries that have arrived in New York, causing a crisis. I'm not sure why the people that run the city of New York are not concerned that these people are going to permanently vote themselves a guaranteed minimum income and free housing or things of that nature. But this is not the way we do things here. The Constitution very clearly ties voting to citizenship, so do most state constitutions. At the very least, most state statutes, require that. So this is just a bizarre case, and this seems to be part of this whole anti-borders, anti-America, let's tear down everything that exists and change it just because we want a revolution.
Well, the knuckleheads you refer to, unfortunately, are not isolated just in New York City. This is a thing now. There are numerous communities throughout the United States that are pushing non-citizen voting. I believe several in Northern California, the San Francisco area, Oakland have done this. And Washington, D.C., the council passed a bill not that long ago with the requirement, the only requirement, you just need to have been living in the city for 30 days. Yep. You don't even have to be, your legal status, your immigration status is not a factor whatsoever. It's just, have you physically been in the city for 30 days?
Yeah, this is crazy. It's happening in Maryland. It's happened in Chicago for school board elections. There have been some jurisdictions in California that have attempted this. And it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This was not really something that was discussed very much prior to the formation of the European Union in the 90s. And they came up with this wonderful idea that because we're all one big happy European Union family, people who are from Germany and move to France under the EU rules should be able to vote in municipal elections because they're affected by arguments about city ordinances and things like that. But they still didn't want any of these people to vote for, say, the Prime Minister of France. And it's like, oh no, we don't want the crazy Germans. And the Germans were saying, Achtung, we don't want the French voting in our country. And it's, it's a crazy situation. As I said before, this goes back to the Roman Empire. Like, voting is associated with citizenship. The vote is taking the temperature of the polity, the political community, on a particular issue, and not every Tom, Dick, and Harry that shows up in your country uninvited to suddenly be exerting influence on the vote in your country. I mean, this has been a strategy of the KGB. I mean, back when the communists were trying to take over, they would infiltrate countries and try and get people to vote for the Marxist candidate. So, I mean, there's broader national security and other implications here. But I think if you're committed to the American way of government, it's just kind of a silly argument in general. Like, if you're not a citizen, what business do you have casting a vote in a U.S. election?
Well, that's interesting because in researching this for today, I looked up more details on the case of Washington, D.C. It's not a city run by a bunch of free thinkers as far as across the ideological spectrum. They're pretty much all left-wing anti-borders city council people. And one of them, who is openly anti-borders, had the temerity to question this bill. And all she said was, I'm paraphrasing now, I question allowing the vote to people that have no connection to U.S. culture or U.S. democracy. Now, that person might be kind of unhinged from where we sit on immigration, but it seems like she's right. I mean, these people have no grounding in why this country is special, why people fought to get here like they did. And it seems like if they don't have that grounding in what this country's about, they're going to be much more susceptible to the lures of unscrupulous politicians who are going to dangle things in front of them for their vote. I mean, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a major problem. I mean, clearly you want people to understand how the American system works, which is why there's a civics and a language requirement as part of naturalizing and becoming a citizen. I think what's even kookier about this whole thing is when you stop and look at the situation from the District of Columbia perspective, D.C. is not a city. It's not a state. Yeah. It's a federal district. It's a unique animal that is a creation of the Constitution. And by definition, any law that's passed in D.C. by any entity that operates here is a federal law. And the federal Constitution clearly says, as well as all the relevant voting statutes, that non-citizens can't vote in federal elections. So I'm not sure where D.C. is going with this, but D.C. has a lot of problems in this regard. D.C. has unilaterally declared marijuana to be legal in the district, and yet it remains illegal under all of the other federal laws. And, the D.C. courts, which are by definition federal courts, haven't addressed any of these issues about the conflict of laws. I think it'll come to that eventually. Perhaps early you'll be involved in something like that at some future point. But this is just craziness. And it seems to me to be connected to a deliberate attempt by the anti-borders globalists to kind of disassemble all of the institutions and safeguards that ensure democracy here in the United States.
Now, people who come at this from a very one world kumbaya interpretation might say, why are you hassling these people? They're among us anyway. They just want to participate in society. What's the harm? You're just practicing otherism. You don't like people that don't look like you or whatever those arguments are. Here's where it leads. Early did an investigation in 2020 into Mecklenburg, North Carolina. That's where Charlotte is. Mm-hmm. Through the research, they found out that 51 immigration violators living there were on voting rolls because of driver's licenses that they were allowed to get. They don't have non-citizen voting in Mecklenburg, and yet this happened. So talk about the perils, the dangers of where that goes.
Well, goes back to an even bigger issue because we have regularly had these debates in the United States about whether we should have a national identity document and whether we should have a central registry of citizens. But with the motor voter laws, what happens is if people don't check the box that they're a U.S. citizen, they register for a license, frequently they're put on the voter rolls. And it's been a problem in other places as well. Back when I was the research director at our sister organization, FAIR, Spencer Raley and I did a study on voter fraud, and there were a couple of other organizations that did them in Virginia and other jurisdictions. And it's a rampant problem throughout the United States. There's huge numbers of people who are not U.S. citizens who are voting in all manner of city, state, local, federal elections. Some of them may be doing it because they just don't understand that they can't, but I think that a large number of them are intentionally doing it because they have interests in things like welfare benefits and free handouts and free education for their children that they're determined to get, and they want to be able to influence that process by voting.
Now, another angle on this that I almost never hear that sounds pretty relevant. People only take it from the perspective of the non-citizen here. Oh, it's unfair to them because of this, this, and this. Isn't it also unfair to the U.S. citizen? Doesn't it water down and cheapen the value of U.S. citizenship? Some people who come to this country work very hard to jump through all the hoops to become legal U.S. citizens. And yet you're going to take people, like in the case of Washington, they've just been here 30 days. What does that do to the integrity of the vote of someone who's here legally?
Well, it deletes it because for every non-citizen you have voting, it potentially cancels out an American citizen's vote. And when you stop and think about people that have obeyed the rules and regulations, I mean, I have a couple of close friends. One of them married a woman from the Philippines. It took her decades to get through the immigration process. I have another friend who's from India who married a woman from India, and the same thing happened. I mean, you have countries where literally the line to get into the U.S. is backlogged 20, 25 years.
So for anyone who says, oh, you just don't like immigrants, well, first of all, that's just crazy on its face. But this concern is looking out for the people from all parts of the world, all different colors, all different faiths, who are playing by the rules.
Yeah, it is. And this whole you don't like immigrants, I mean, it's ridiculous. My wife's family came from Germany. I come from a family of people who my grandfather's family came here from Sweden. My other grandfather's family came here from Ireland. And they all did it lawfully according to regulations that existed at the time. But I can remember my grandparents talking about this. They said, hey, listen, we came here because we wanted to live in a country that had rules, where everybody obeyed the rules, including the government. We didn't want to be in a place where the rules just get tossed to the wind when whoever is in power decides that's what they want to do. And I think when you get into tolerating unlawfully present people here and allowing them to vote, what you're doing is you're saying, oh, just ignore the immigration laws if you don't like them. And then what you're going to do is you're going to discourage people from obeying the rules and attract opportunists to come here.
Yeah. Now, just to wrap this up, we mentioned that early submitted briefs in both of these cases. Tell us real quick, because some people may not have the background on this, why is a friend of the court brief important? What is it, and why is it valuable to this process?
Sure. So one of the things that Early does is we submit amicus curiae briefs. Those are a friend of the court brief. And those are a method by which the court solicits various interpretations of the legal arguments. The most important arguments are the ones made by the parties. However, when there are complex legal issues, the courts want to get outside expertise from organizations like ours that are familiar over the long haul with the law and how it's applied. And so they solicit what's called a friend of the court brief. And what those are essentially background briefs that allow the court to inform itself about the ways in which influential groups with an interest in the issue see the law as being interpreted. And, sometimes the court reads them all and they go in the circular file and they decide based entirely on the pleadings filed by the parties. In other cases, when the issues are really complicated, the courts will pay a lot of attention to those if they find them persuasive. And they might not necessarily cite them, but it helps inform the judge's background analysis of the law.
Okay, we'll be right back.
The Biden administration is reversing America's progress on immigration, reversing ICE's ability to deport criminal illegal aliens, reversing job protections for Americans, and construction of the wall. That's why I've joined EARLY, the Immigration Reform Law Institute. EARLY uses the courts to stop bad immigration policies. Join me. Support EARLY at early.org. Help win the immigration fight in the courtroom. Paid for by the Immigration Reform Law Institute.
And we're back. How's it going, Matt?
It's going well.
All right. So if you go to the early website, you may notice some things you've seen before. And the reason for that is because in a lot of different news websites, you'll see op-eds, commentaries written by early staff. And there were two here that we wanted to talk about because there's some interesting stuff in it. One of them was written by you, Matt, and it appeared in Breitbart. And the headline was Jean-Pierre, shh, the alien smugglers might hear you. And this refers to Karine Jean-Pierre, who is far from the most brilliant press secretary the United States has ever had. But she said some pretty jaw-dropping stuff recently at the podium regarding immigration. What was that? And tell me what your piece was about.
Well, Brian, she says some pretty jaw-dropping stuff most of the time,
Yes.
given that she appears to be a bit of an empty vessel. But she made the shocking statement during a press conference that the White House needed to be careful talking about the goings-on at the border because if it said too much, it would tip off the alien smugglers and human traffic. Oh, did I say the A word? I did.
You can't say it with the I word, I think.
It would tip off the migrant smugglers and the human traffickers because they would be able to figure out that there were problems going on at the border as if they didn't know this already, and that's the reason why they were streaming over. And I wrote the piece because I was utterly flabbergasted, gobsmacked that anyone in a position that senior in the federal government would just lie to the American people like that. And to make an assertion that's so ridiculous. It's like everyone knows there's a crisis at the border, and if she thinks for a moment that the cartels and the human traffickers are not paying attention to this, then she's living on another planet.
So I'm just trying to understand, in her world, the people who do this human trafficking at the border, who have machetes and chainsaws and torture people, they're waiting to hear what the Washington Press Corps is going to tell them about the questions they ask of Karine Jean-Pierre, and based on that, that's what they're going to decide to do.
Oh no, Brian. All of those men with bushy mustaches and cigars sitting in adobe buildings south of the border are tuned in directly to Peter Ducey and
Yes.
the questions that he asks about the border so that they can plan how they are going to rape, pillage, and rampage in the border zone. And if dear Mr. Ducey would just be quiet about all this, then Karine and her crew at the White House would be able to fix the border. How ridiculous is that?
Why don't they just, for those press conferences, just have everyone else leave and just have Peter Ducey and Karine Jean-Pierre, because he's the only one that seems to be asking any challenging questions of her.
Well, because eventually she'd wind up either melting down or throwing something at him because he asks her questions that she can't answer, not because she doesn't have the information, but if she gave him an honest answer, she would be admitting what a complete and total disaster of a situation the Biden administration has made, not just out of the border, but out of immigration policy in general.
Yeah. There was who's the person on ABC News? Woodruff, I think her last name is. She interviewed Greg Abbott on a tarmac somewhere, and she was basically saying to him, you know, you're the only one talking about the border crisis. Joe Biden doesn't talk about the border crisis. Aren't you encouraging this? So it's not necessarily a problem to open the border and create a humanitarian crisis, but to talk about it, that's the real crime.
Yeah, that's the image they're trying to portray. But the truth of the matter is this is not a crisis for the Biden administration. This is the Biden administration attempting to bring in compliant administrative state supplicants who are dependent upon the government for everything. And they figured that if people come here and they give them enough freebies, eventually when they become, when Team Biden and its ilk succeed in getting a mass amnesty declared, that when these people all become citizens and are eligible to vote, they'll wind up voting for progressive candidates in whatever variety of the extreme radical globalist anti-borders one world kumbaya contingent that happens to be in the ascendant at that time. And the fact is they may not be wrong. I mean, there have been attempts in the United States in the past to change the political demographics. I worked for the old INS back during one of them, which was called Citizenship USA, which was Bill Clinton's attempt to mint enough new Democratic voters to make sure that he won in a landslide. So there's nothing mysterious going on here. What's mysterious is the fact that they think they're pulling one over on the American public. It's like when you're a teenager and your mom heard you sneaking in at night and she was like, "Were you out?" And you went, "No." And, nobody was fooling anyone.
Yeah. Well, then another angle on this that you don't hear that often. I heard it recently. Tom Homans, early senior fellow, former ICE acting director, said this in an interview that people say, well, if they're non-citizens, and going back to our last segment, if there's non-citizen voting in that particular place, then what's the harm? They're not going to, or why do anti-borders politicians want them here if they can't vote? Well, he said something that, again, I don't hear very often, which is they have also jerry-rigged the census rules so that they're counting non-citizens in the census. So even if they don't vote, those jurisdictions will get greater representation in Congress simply because they have more immigration violators living among them.
Yeah, there's been a number of what I consider supremely misguided court cases that claim that, well, those people are living here and this is the democracy, so they have a right to be heard, which is kind of like you come home and find squatters living in your apartment and somebody tells you, well, they have a right to be heard. They moved the television, they must have wanted it in a different place. I mean, it's just a silly argument, and Tom is right on with that. And I think that it's a very cynical manipulation. These are U.S. politicians who are doing this to gain and maintain power, but clearly, since they're so interested in catering to foreign nationals, they're not interested about what the people that can vote in the United States think of them and their policies. And that's just the really shocking thing about this. And what's even more shocking is that in a lot of ways, except for the vote, we've essentially erased all distinctions between people who have migrated here lawfully and U.S. citizens. Really, the only thing that citizens can do that lawful permanent residents can't do is vote and serve as a commissioned officer in the armed forces. You also have an unfettered right to depart and return to the U.S., but those are the only three differences. And we're fast approaching the point where we're erasing all distinction between people who were permitted to come here lawfully and people who just showed up uninvited.
Now, there's a section of the piece you wrote here, and again, it's available on Breitbart.com and early.org. I want to read this to you real quick and just have you react. So you wrote here, so what is the end game? Allow a massive number of illegals into the United States. Stop using that word.
You use the I word,
every
Brian.
time. I know, I said it.
It's not nice, Brian. No person can be illegal.
I'm going to make it YouTube friendly. So what is the end game? Allow a massive number of immigration violators into the United States, follow up with claims that we lack the resources and the political will to deport them all, and in any case, it would be inhumane to do so. Insist that the only way to proceed is to declare amnesty and start over.
Yeah, I mean, this is the end game. How many times have you heard political commentators going, oh, well, there's 11 million illegals. And, that number has been the same for like the last 14 or 15 years. So it inevitably must be higher than 11 million. But people go, oh, 11 million to 30 million. I use the I word there. Immigration violators. We're in the United States without permission, without sanction. How could we possibly remove them all? Well, the only commentator that I've heard say, how do we know, because we haven't tried, is Mark Levin on his show. He did a great show about this a few years back. And he's 100% right. We don't know because we haven't tried. But that's the argument that's used. And somehow it's inhumane to tell people who we didn't invite, who showed up here without our permission, to leave because they like it here. And, I'm just wondering if I went to one of the mansions in Newport, Rhode Island and moved in and said, well, I like it here a lot better than I like my modest home in Virginia, would anybody be sympathetic? Or would they just kick me out? They would kick me out. I mean, and it's really, when it comes down to it, unlawful migration is a form of trespass, a trespass on the public domain of the United States. And when you deport people, you're simply evicting them. It's just like evicting somebody from an apartment. Legally speaking, if I'm living in an apartment, I haven't paid the rent, or I never had any authorization to be there, and I'm evicted, how does anyone punish me? They're just putting me back in the situation that I had before, which is I can go to places where I have permission to be, but I can't stay in the ones that I don't have permission to inhabit.
When you mentioned Newport, Rhode Island, I thought the episode last summer about the migrants being sent to Martha's Vineyard to be so revealing, wasn't it? Because these are people who, when they vote, when they talk to their people, when they're chattering their wine glasses, they're probably saying all kinds of things about how sanctuaries are the best. Sanctuaries, we ought to let them all come in. And the second they landed on that island, the first thing you heard is, well, they can't stay here. We got to work out something to get them out of here. And they were gone within 48 hours.
Well, because all those Chardonnay-swilling liberals living on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket in Massachusetts are the biggest racists in the entire world. It's like, if you're not a millionaire and you're not a Caucasian tourist, then they don't want you where they live unless you're there to clean the toilets or vacuum the house. I mean, it's the most disgraceful thing I've ever heard. And what really kills me about this is that the sheriff in Bayshore County in Texas tried to claim that sending these people to Martha's Vineyard was a human rights violation. I'll tell you something. I grew up in...
Can I get violated like that?
I grew up in...
Look pretty nice on TV.
I grew up in Lynn, Massachusetts, on the coast just north of Boston. You know how many times I've been to Martha's Vineyard?
None.
None, because I can't afford to go. It's so ridiculously expensive. So these people got flown in a chartered flight in a beautiful aircraft to lovely Martha's Vineyard. We're given cast-off vineyard vines and LL Bean clothing by the lovely denizens of the island, and then treated to butter-poached lobster rolls in the basement of the Congregational Church. If that's a human rights violation, then where do I sign up?
Just think how awkward that must have been for those residents there, because you get, again, they're probably all millionaires. They virtue signal their pro-sanctuary beliefs everywhere. And yet, now the cameras are on them. There was media there, and they're talking to these people. I've seen these interviews, and they have to say to them, we want you to have the best. You're going to be taken care of, blah, blah, blah. But in the back of the mind, they're thinking, how soon do I get these people out of here? Because they're messing up the view for them, basically.
Well, right, because if you're in that little cloistered Martha Stewart world where you don't allow reality to intrude, people coming from places where things aren't quite as nice are a big problem. And I mean, it's just the most insane hypocrisy. And what really upsets me about those people is if you grow up blue collar like I did in Milltown, the attitude of those people is, oh, it's fine for them all to go live in Lynn or Lowell or Lawrence, but don't put them in Wellesley or Lexington or out on the islands. If these people think that all immigrants unvetted and admitted to the United States without any discretion whatsoever are so wonderful, then why don't they want them living in their backyards?
Well, it's the same thing with Eric Adams, Muriel Bowser, Lori Lightfoot. They were perfectly fine with South Texas being the dumping ground for all of this. But the second it came into their city, even though they proclaimed to the heavens that they're a sanctuary community, this is a crisis. We got to declare an emergency. We need a payout from the federal government. So you're okay with them in Texas overwhelming those communities, but the second it comes on your doorstep, now it's a problem.
Well, and the other thing that kills me is this whole notion of sanctuary is just absurd. It's like, what leaves any of these jurisdictions thinking that they're entitled to just bail on any segment of federal law that they happen to dislike. I mean, if you suggested to them that, well, you know, I'm a big supporter of corporate America, and I think all these EPA regulations are terrible, and I would like to turn the Cape Cod marshes into a toxic waste dumping ground, they'd have a meltdown. And so it's just the complete flaming hypocrisy and the inconsistency in the logic is mind-boggling, and I think it's very telling about what kind of folks these people really are.
And you know, the inverse of that is, you're from Massachusetts, I'm sure you remember this story. Weren't they going to put a wind farm within view of the Kennedy compound at Cape Cod? And didn't Teddy Kennedy put the kibosh on that?
Oh, God forbid that we ruin Teddy's view or have the sounds going on with those giant, menacing, post-apocalyptic looking windmills. But in any case...
And no doubt he was happy to send it to some other community. Just don't ruin my beach view. Yeah.
So that was my commentary, but you had a great one that you just put out talking about the stereotype of the lazy American. And this is something that I think is really interesting. Ann Coulter has done some writing on this, and I know Ann can be a little bit controversial, but I've met her a number of times. I find her to be an interesting person, and she said that those in favor of unchecked mass migration are always pushing the stereotype of native-born Americans as lazy, and she called it the civic religion of treating every non-American as better than an American, a potential valedictorian, Medal of Honor winner, and Nobel Prize recipient. So you wrote a great piece on this. What is this all about? Talk to me about why this stereotype exists and what the other side is trying to do with it.
Sure. That piece, by the way, is also available on AmericanGreatness.com, or AM Greatness, I think it's called, but great news site. Check it out. Also on the early site. This is tied to labor, and this is tied to labor costs. And corporate America has cut this unholy alliance with Congress, where they need a steady flow of indigent people to come in that they can exploit, essentially, to pay them substandard wages at the expense of American workers. Now, where the lazy American part comes in is because they will say, we need all these people. There's over 300 million people in America. But they'll say, and someone might say, well, why do we need more? I mean, it seems like we have lots of people here. Well, they need to be here to do the jobs Americans just won't do. You've heard this many, many times. They'll say this. And there are a number of cases that I cite in this piece that put the lie to that because, for example, in the Mississippi Delta region, there was a lawsuit that just got settled between a group of black Americans who were farm workers down there suing these two agribusiness farm companies. And what happened was they had jobs with these companies. They were working on the farms, getting paid. They were legal citizens. The farm companies got rid of them and brought in, ironically, white South Africans on these visas. What is it, Matt? H2A.
It's H2A.
Yeah,
yep.
H2A. They brought in these white South Africans on these visas, displaced black American citizens in these jobs. So, and they're, you know, for what? For why? Because they want them out, because they want these people in. So don't tell me that these are jobs Americans just won't do. They're doing them. They were doing them. And now they're unemployed. So it's just ridiculous. And then the other thing that I cite in there, Nancy Pelosi, the now deposed Speaker of the House, was asked about this last year, and she gave this self-righteous speech at the podium there, and she said, some of the farmers and growers in Florida are saying, why are you shipping these immigrants up north? We need them to pick the crops down here. So there she is telling the quiet part out loud. That's, to someone like Pelosi, talk about Chardonnay sipping. I mean, she's as upper 1% as it gets. When she sees these people, what does she think other than manual labor?
It's absurd. It's the most racist thing in the entire world.
She's the one who said MS-13 gang members with the tattoos all over the face have the spark of divinity in them. And yet, here is what she really thinks. They're nothing but crop pickers to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy and it's offensive. Let me ask you one final question on this. What does this do to innovation, and what does it do to people who are looking to maybe get into the agribusiness but can't afford to compete?
They will have to play by the rules of hiring non-citizens at virtual slave labor wages, or they can't compete.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, and I just wonder, why is so much agricultural work done manually now?
Yeah.
You would think that that people would be building machines to do it and getting highly paid to build the machines.
Exactly. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Tom Homan, the former ICE director under President Trump. I'm also a senior fellow with Immigration Reform Law Institute. I'm down here in the Rio Grande Valley witnessing firsthand the catastrophe created by the Biden administration. Look, I spent 34 years enforcing immigration law. I started as a Border Patrol agent on the border. I've seen administrations come and go, but the Biden administration is out of control. And that's why when I retired, I partnered with Immigration Reform Law Institute, because they do the work of the American people. Please go to Immigration Reform Law Institute. Help them do their job. Help them to complete their mission. The ACLU has them outnumbered with lawyers, that have them outnumbered with funds. We need your help to help the Immigration Reform Law Institute be able to hire more attorneys, to have more funding to take on this administration. They've already proven how successful they can be, and we can win this battle with your help and with the Immigration Reform Law Institute. Thank you.
Let's look at the news, see what's going on. I think there's a couple items here that I'm going to want to hear your take on, Matt. Here's one that was on Twitter. Port Director Michael W. Humphreys for CBP, Customs Border Protection, wrote, on January 13th, CBP officers at the Nogales, Arizona Point of Entry, POE?
Port of Entry.
Port of Entry, sorry. Seized approximately 953,000 fentanyl pills and 2.65 pounds of cocaine concealed within commercial equipment in a vehicle. Most of the pills were the traditional blue color, some were green in color, and some were rainbow colored.
Well, it's disturbing. I mean, clearly the rainbow colored is supposed to pull children into this and make this look like it's something interesting. But anyone who thinks that illegal migration is no big deal and that all migrants are just wonderful people coming here looking for work should really pay a close attention to this story. Pay very close attention to it, because as the Biden administration has intentionally destroyed any and all border enforcement, drug traffickers, people smugglers, gun runners have all been flooding the border zone with all manner of dangerous contraband. And so we've been seeing not only record numbers of alien apprehensions at the border, but record numbers of people being apprehended with things like fentanyl, cocaine, marijuana, girls who they're trying to sell into prostitution, automatic weapons, all kinds of disturbing things. This is why if you have no border, you have no country.
This story is sickening on a number of levels. One, fentanyl is now the number one cause of death for adults in America 18 to 45. They're making these pills look like kids' candy, so a kid could potentially get it somewhere, think it's candy, eat it, and die. Thirdly, someone might look at this and say, well, they seized it, so now it's off the streets. Well, yes. However, anyone in this business will tell you for whatever they seize, a good amount also got through. So, yeah, it's great that this didn't get in the streets, but you've got to think a bunch of it did get through.
Well, listen, I spent many years as a trial attorney with ICE. I was involved in the deportation of many large-scale drug dealers. The thing about this is these guys build in potential losses like this into their distribution systems. So that means if this got caught, how many millions of these pills were stuffed in the back of some other kind of truck, hidden in goods that were shipped over to the U.S. or whatever, and are now being consumed in places like Washington, D.C., Boston, New York City, Chicago, L.A.
Yeah. So we were talking about sanctuary cities earlier. Here's one from your old home state there, Matt. Breitbart wrote, Feds, sanctuary city Boston shielded over 100 criminal immigration violators over deportation last year. Talk about what 287G is and why that factors into this.
So 287G was a special program that ICE started that allowed local jurisdictions to actively partner with ICE to find foreign criminals who were living in their jurisdictions and to get them put into the immigration process. But the fact is that 287G was a method of convenience for the federal government. You don't really need that. The federal government has jurisdiction over immigration, and when they ask a police department to turn somebody over, the police department is not in any position to say no, because that's what's called a preempted federal area. The Constitution gives the federal government exclusive control over immigration. What's even more mind-boggling about this story is the Boston police tried to originally claim that they refused to hand over only 12 people. Well, it turns out it was well over 100, and ICE publicly went to the press and refuted the claim that it was a mere dozen. So that's 100 criminals that the Boston police wasted time and effort returning to the streets of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts when they could have relied on ICE to take those people out of the jurisdiction altogether. So what you have is the Boston police protecting foreign criminals from American law enforcement instead of protecting the residents of Boston and of the Bay State at large from criminals who shouldn't have been here in the first place.
Now, the law that allows them to do this there is called the Boston Trust Act.
Yes.
So the Boston Police Department released a statement on this, and they said, the Boston Police Department remains committed to the Boston Trust Act and strengthening relationships in all our communities. Boston's immigrant community should feel safe in reporting crime and in proactively engaging with the Boston Police Department. Now, there's a couple untruths in that statement, or distractions, distortions. When they have this sanctuary set up, you've got immigration violators who come to the city because they know it's a sanctuary. Mm-hmm. They may very well be peaceful people. They're not MS-13. They're not bent on mayhem. For whatever reason, they want to make more money, a job, whatever it is. They go there. Then you've got this criminal element of the immigration violators who come there for the same reason. They know they're not going to get hauled out by the feds. However, where do those people often live? They live in the same communities where the peaceful people here illegally live, and they prey on them.
Well, Brian, they live in the same communities where the illegally present immigrants live. Right. And so this whole thing, nobody has ever produced a shred of evidence indicating that these policies increase the willingness of immigrant populations to cooperate with the police. That's a kooky assertion that some academic in an ivory tower came up with, and there's never been a single shred of evidence. It's convenience for politicians that want to pursue these kind of policies. The fact is that most of the people who don't want to cooperate with the police, who come from different countries, are people who come from countries where the police are to be feared, because they're corrupt, and they won't interact with the police under any circumstances, no matter what. I ran, when I worked for USCIS, the S1 visa, the witness and snitch visa program. And the fact is that most of the people that we dealt with in that program were not going to cooperate with the police unless they were being offered something to their benefit. And you know, that highlights another point. Part of how we view civic responsibility in the United States is you protect your friends and neighbors by going to the police when a crime has been committed and by standing up and testifying in a court of law. So I don't know. This whole approach just strikes me as ridiculous, and I think it puts the police in a position where they're sending the wrong message. The police are supposed to combat crime. They're not supposed to condone it, suborn it, and aid and abet it. And the fact is that there isn't any distinction other than jurisdictionally between federal law enforcement and state and local law enforcement. They're all police. They're all supposed to be dedicated to enforcing the law and protecting the public. And when you do this, you send a bad message to criminals that they can get away with the law if they fall into get away with violating the law if they fall into a special protected class.
And just in case anyone thinks that, well, this is just a couple kook politicians in Boston, it's just random. There is coordination on this. This is also from the Breitbart article. Nationwide, President Joe Biden's administration is imposing a so-called sanctuary country agenda that has seen ICE dramatically cut the number of detainers used to request custody of criminal immigration violators. They're championing this like they've done this great thing for these people. They're actually putting them in more danger.
Yeah, detainer is a request from ICE or any law enforcement agency to another law enforcement agency. And what it says is, listen, you've got someone in custody. I have a legal reason to take that person into custody. You can consider them in the receiving agency's custody and hold on to them, and we'll come get them. And yeah, so when ICE reduces the number of these detainers, they're letting criminals out that go into migrant neighborhoods. They prey upon the other migrants. I've seen this thousands of times in my 30 years of working with immigration. And it's just a bad scene all around. And this is the overall problem. The Biden administration is communicating a message to the world. The border is open. Come here. And if you get here, you'll be able to stay.
And here it is broken down into numbers. This is, again, from the Breitbart article. In fiscal year 2022, ICE agents issued fewer than 79,000 detainers for criminal immigration violators, a 56% decline in the total number of detainers issued by ICE agents compared to fiscal year 2018. So what that means, there are people who should be out of this country who are very well wanted on things like rape, robbery, murder, drug dealing, weapons dealing,
sexual abuse of
you
children.
name it, who should be out of the community, who are still in the community. Tell me how that makes a community safer.
No, it doesn't. They're actively being shielded by the police. And if the police think that the locals are going to go to the police to talk about crime when they know the police are protecting these people from La Migra, it's ridiculous. It just doesn't make any sense. So,
What's La Migra?
La Migra is Spanish for immigration. It's short for immigration.
Got it. Okay.
And that's what people in Spanish-speaking migrant communities call the INS and ICE. So you raise a couple of interesting points here, and this brings us to the next thing that we need to take a look at. So we have two different situations where we have what I would call migrants misbehaving. And you have to wonder why people who are allegedly fleeing persecution and potential violence aren't more grateful and well-behaved when they get here. But a lot of these recent arrivals who have shown up in New York City, according to an employee at a Big Apple hotel that the city contracted with to house these people, says that the migrants are spending their days drinking, smoking marijuana, and having sex in the hallways, all courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. Meanwhile, they're hoarding free clothes that they've been given and insisting that they'll only eat certain types of food, tossing out whatever they don't like, and allowing it to go to waste and rot in the hallways. Meanwhile, asylum-seeking Afghans have done $189 million in damage to U.S. military bases where they were being housed. That's right. Americans fought to free Afghanistan from the Taliban, and now we have Afghans coming here, and they've destroyed everything from walls to ceilings to plumbing systems in barracks on military bases. So what do you say about all of that?
Think of how many lies this administration told us about the Afghan refugees. They told us they were all vetted before they left Afghanistan. Turned out that was a lie.
Yep.
Then some of them said, well, they were vigorously vetted after they got here on an army base or whatever. That wasn't necessarily true either.
No, it wasn't. And, the fact is it's hard to vet people from places that don't have record systems, and it becomes even harder when they're further away from the country. But it's shocking to me that we gave these people refuge when they claimed that they were afraid of being killed. And what do? They come here and they run on a rampage, destroying the dwellings of the very military people that freed them from the Taliban.
These are the people we were told love America, helped America. Some of them very well may have over there. But then now this army base in Wisconsin, apparently they sent some real characters there, because there was another one where a female army staffer was assaulted by one of them there. Mm-hmm. So, and then also, didn't it come out also that very few of the total number brought here were actually working as assets to the U.S. military over there?
It was a tiny number of them. And the fact is that the way that Afghanistan operates politically, culturally, and socially, a lot of the people who were working for us were working for the Taliban. and trying to work both sides of the aisle at the same time. And we don't know how many of these people are terrorists. There's a stunning number of them that came up on terrorist watch lists after they were admitted to the United States. And there's a massive number of these people that have been admitted that have now been placed on the no-fly list and aren't allowed to board commercial airliners here in the U.S. So this is a mess, and it's a disaster waiting to happen.
And even if they did help military personnel in Afghanistan, the fact that they were either so poorly vetted or not vetted at all brings up the question. A lot of polls have been done and things like that in that part of the world. And they said, do you believe in Sharia law? A lot of them say yes. Do you believe in honor killings? Yes. Do you believe people who are gay should be killed? Yes. These are now you're bringing them over here and just throwing them into American society. This is a recipe for problems.
Oh, yeah, it's a disaster. I mean, the fact is it's a drastically different culture. Most of these people were not fighting for the United States. They were fighting for a better Afghanistan, and they decided to align with what looked like it was going to be the winning side. And, this is a perfect example of why unchecked mass migration is not a good idea. When you bring people into the U.S. from cultures that are drastically different, you have to give them time to learn the ropes and acclimate to American society. And if you don't, it's not fair to the migrants. Yeah. And so the Biden administration, because it was virtue signaling after it completely messed up the withdrawal from Afghanistan, threw these people into the U.S. and now is trying to hide the fact that they're behaving in ways that are not socially and culturally acceptable here in our society.
Now, on another story, this is from Matt Vespa at Town Hall. Where did New York City's mayor go? Why did New York City's mayor go to the border? One simple reason. And they get into it here. And it's really stunning how Eric Adams has gotten religion on this topic once it started to hit his city in the pocketbook. He wants a handout from the federal government to cover the losses that all these migrants coming to the city have caused them. And, he's saying things. This guy was viciously attacking Greg Abbott just a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And now he's talking about how it's unacceptable, there's no room at the inn, things like that. But here's one he said that I thought was really relevant. He said, he's talking about the money that the city is expending on this. That money comes from our schools. It comes from our public safety, our hospitals, our infrastructure. Those are our tax dollars that's coming from, and we've got to see an impact in every service we have in the city. This is what immigration enforcement people have been saying all along.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy. I mean, he's basically come face to face with the opposite side of the arguments that he's been making, and he doesn't want to wrap his brain around the reality that these are people who come here with nothing, without marketable job skills, without language skills, and in today's economy, they cannot integrate the way that they did in the New York City of the 1920s and 30s. But here's the other thing, Brian. In the New York City of the 1920s and the 30s, one of the reasons that we let people in from the countries we did is because we knew there were established groups of Italians and Irish and Eastern European Jewish people from Russia and Ukraine and places like that who were going to help their friends and relatives who were coming here assimilate. One of the problems that New York is having now is these people have all shown up and they want to act just like they did in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Afghanistan, or Pakistan, or wherever. They don't want to act like Americans. And the fact is that never works, and what it leads to is balkanization and social fracture, which are never good for any kind of city or country or any kind of political unit. And the fact is, in the 1920s and 30s, these people were coming from disparate places all over the world in a clearly less evolved climate in terms of the way people thought about race and religion and things like that, and yet they all managed to get along well with each other. I have older friends and relatives who lived in the New York of that era and told me what a nice and fascinating place it is. Now, New York is dirty and dangerous, and nobody seems to know how to run it correctly. You have a lot of virtue signaling going on, but not a whole lot of leadership or governance.
Right. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the show with your friends. For more on the Immigration Reform Law Institute, visit irli.org, as well as on our social media at Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and others. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
No border, no country.